what you're describing seems to me to be, I mean, and I agree in general with, I think, all of what you're saying, but it's a model of mental function, of informational function, in my sense of the word information. It has to do with distinctions, and there are lots of automatic things that we do. We can drive to work and not realize all the things that have been going on, and not have awareness of that, because we've delegated those processes to lower level brain circuits that handle it without error. So I think you need to think about, again, in terms of models, you don't need awareness per se in a mental model of information processing model for the model to predict the functions that they can carry out. So I'm not against functional models, but they are of a different sort than physical models. And awareness requires bridge laws between two different kinds of variables, the neural variables on one hand, and the experiential observables on the other. And
that's exactly what we're trying to do, to make that bridge.
Yes, and good luck. It's a hard problem in making a theory, not a hard problem in understanding why it exists.
I wanted to make a comment here, if possible. I think, first of all, I wanted to add something to what Francis just shared. I think what can be imagined as kind of something that can be imagined, as opposed to what Francis said, is that if you do meditation, like for example, mindfulness meditation or a normal meditation, when you sit quietly and you're observing what's going on in your mind, it's that observation that you're doing on the things that are in your awareness. It's that kind of observation that we're talking about. Then you decide what course of thought or what course of basically option that is available in your field to take. So I think that is a way of thinking.
So how do you think about the you that's doing the deciding? I guess
That's a very good question. I think for the model I put, how can we measure the local field theory? I thought of these basically 3-layer way of measuring it. The first layer was this studying of the awareness. And I mean, I didn't put it in the presentation because it was 7 slides, but in my own notes, which I didn't share, is that I assume 4 positions for awareness. The position 1 was the position of basically hidden awareness, meaning that you don't notice it. It's exactly like the sun is shining, you're walking on your day, you're feeling it is there, but you're not consciously aware of it. It's there. It's exactly like automation of certain tasks that we don't think about them because they have been basically integrated into the experience. The 4th dimension, which for me was the most, like, in my opinion, is the most interesting one, and I hope that with the local field we can promote it further, is this awareness of the awareness. So for example, people that had revelations, people who had higher states of awareness experiences and that had changed their lives or higher quality of life, somehow they have become super aware of the awareness, that by observing what is out there, they have become moved by it. Some people look at a bird and they just see an ordinary bird on an ordinary tree on an ordinary day. But some other people, because of how they have cultivated the internal field, they see some sort of a beautiful poetic experience. So that's kind of a different position of awareness that in the study of the awareness part I had, and I didn't put it in the presentation. So for me, the awareness function is coming from a background of resilience and complex adaptive system, can be seen also in survivors of, for example, trauma experiences, post-traumatic stress disorder. Their awareness is basically hijacked by this traumatic experience. So my question is, can we also have the opposite function of an awareness that is heightened or is elevated, so they have elevated experiences? I stop here, so maybe there is a call.
Yeah, I think the idea of mindfulness is a very nice kind of exercise. Within mindfulness, you're not following an idea the way we normally think. You're trying to put consciousness in the role of the observer and seeing all these different impulses that come from different parts of the nervous system. Now, of course, I understand your question, Peter, like, who is the we or who is the you that is doing that observing? That is where exactly for the global workspace come in. The global workspace is in a sense doing the observing. The global workspace allows things to come in, but usually because there is a competition, because there is a kind of a mutual exclusion, when one thought or one object becomes a focus of consciousness, it automatically suppresses the other. That's the mechanism of attention. If you pay attention to one thing, there's automatically a suppression and inhibition of things that are irrelevant to your focus. What you try to do with mindfulness meditation is exactly not creating a focus, like not allowing any of these things to become dominant, and then you see more like what James calls the stream of consciousness. You see all these things flowing by, like you're sitting at the river and you see a leaf and a branch and a bottle, and they are passing by, and you're not focusing on any of them. You see that they are there. I think that is more a way to see the field as this range of possibilities. Well, usually we are focused on one of these things, and then we forget that there is this field of potential. And what the experience is for me is, that's the aspect that I don't have time to explain, that I briefly tried to say it with those 6 dimensions. Actually, this started first for me as a model of meaning with 6 dimensions. And then I understood that it's a model of meaning, not just in the long term, what's the meaning of my life, but it's also a meaning of at this moment. What am I experiencing? Is it good? Is it bad? What can I do about it? Where does it come from? What are the next things that may happen? These are all the components of my experience, these implicit predictions, fears, anticipations, desires. They are all there. They are part of your experience. For example, the simplest experience is like pain. You put your hand on a hot plate. First, you will retract it immediately before you become conscious of it. That's the subconscious part. But the conscious part is that you will feel the pain, and the pain tells you this is a situation you don't want to stay in. You can force yourself to keep your hand on the hot plate until the pain becomes so big that you really need to pull it away if you don't want to get burned. But what is the feeling of pain? It is this pressure, this tension that tells you, don't stay here, go away from there, take away that hand. And
the reflexes also have functional significance, but we're not aware when we have a reflex reaction, we're not aware that we're doing that. We're aware of the pain afterwards, but we're not aware of the reflex itself. That's all I'm saying, is that the awareness itself, we want to understand the neural basis of the structure of our experiences. I think our experiences are as real as anything else. But we need to be clear about the nature of the relations between our experiences and what's going on in the brain and in the informational processes that constitute the mind. So I would say think about this problem a bit more. Look at Jaegwon Kim's debates about this in the philosophical literature, and you might want to reconsider some of those relationships. I agree. Most people think
really
that
open to modification. It's not the final thing.
I mean, I have, of course, not heard everything about consciousness, but lately I've been reading lots of stuff, both from neurophysiologists, from philosophers, I think I know more or less where the terrain is, and I see that there is a gap somewhere there, and it's that gap that we are trying to fill. As I said at the beginning of it here, it needs to be fleshed out, it needs to be turned into a paper, but I see very clearly where the gap is. The gap is indeed between the neural processes and the subjective experience, and what the local field here does is precisely bridging the two, saying, things that you feel, what is feeling? Feeling typically is something that pushes, that drives attention. It's not just neutral, it's something that affects you. It is being affected. How does it connect to?
Well, attention can also be driven by non-conscious processes, in the auditory system.
Yeah, but that's what I said.
Even if we're asleep, we can be aroused by sounds.
No, but that's what I gave with my example of the bacterium. The bacterium undergoes attention, but the bacterium does not have the range of possibilities. To have the range of possibilities, it needs to go into the global workspace, which means it needs to be maintained for a while in working memory, so that it can interact with all these other modules, all these other neural circuits. And it's out of this conversation, you might say, between all these neural models and the context and the contents of your consciousness, that it finally realizes one of the potentialities. It is this time, it's like consciousness takes the time to think, instead of the reflex, the subconscious one. You put your hand on the plate, you pull it away immediately, there is no choice. You don't have the choice of not doing it, it goes automatically. What consciousness does is it takes the time, it keeps things long enough so that this range is there, and that range is largely implicit. It's kind of fuzzy, it's kind of vague, but it's out of that range that something gets selected, and that is then the conscious decision.
But we also do similar things like that in sleep, right? Our brains are cogitating about what ideas we've been considering the rest of the day. There are very famous examples of people having eureka moments from in their sleep, basically. So without awareness at the time of having those thoughts. So again, we just need to be careful about the observables that go along with experience, and the observables that go along with brain states, and the observables that go along with mental informational functions. And there's overlap, and there are linkage relations between what's going on in the informational realm in the mind and what we are aware of. But it's not a simple relation, and one needs to pay attention to that. It's always, we always, I know this position is not the most widely held. Intuitively, we think that our awareness is driving everything. And we don't think that we don't think that our actions are caused by subliminal processes mainly or even partially. We think that we, as our conscious awareness, are in control. So it's counterintuitive to have this position that awareness is epiphenomenal. I also work in the domain of music and the brain, and people want to attribute everything that's in the mind, they want to attribute some selective value to. And so people concoct all sorts of evolutionary theories about why it is that we might like music and how humans are special and that we like music. But it could be a structural reason. It could be that music is particularly effective in driving the brain circuits, and that's a kind of an explanation that isn't necessarily adaptationist and selectionist in that way. Not to say that those things aren't ruled out, but we just shouldn't automatically think that awareness has a function because we feel it to be so. You can't just assert that awareness has a function without giving arguments and evidence for that.
Okay, let's hear from friends that's not spoken yet so far. Larry, Morris, Claudia, Michael, Igor, Audie. You have something to say? Yeah, Morris, go ahead.
Hi. Well, I'm relatively new to this field. I wrote a paper which was published in Systems beginning of the year, which produces a model that differentiates cognition from affect and shows how, consistent with France's ideas, shows how affect actually impacts on cognition. And in the propositions that I made, consciousness was a consequence of the interaction of sapience and sentience. The paper was actually deriving from the Google anomaly, where an engineer in AI said that their chatbot was sentient. And I was interested in identifying what sentience was and how it related to sapience. Anyway, that was the beginning. But it strikes me that there are a number of issues that, all of which have been discussed here at some level. For instance, there are levels of consciousness, according to Bitbal and Luisi, who published their paper in about 2003. And they describe the different levels that occur. And those levels of consciousness are related to the capacity for a cognitive system to operate, and the complexity that is enabled within that those processes. So different levels of complexity end up with different levels of consciousness, if you want. There's also the issue of fields. And now, as Francis has indicated, fields can be defined most generally in terms of vectors, but one can also define fields in relation to data processing. One of the I worked with Roy Friedan from the US, who developed a theory, a very important theory as far as I'm concerned. It's a probabilistic theory using Fisher information. And we used that in a paper we published a couple of years ago to explain how Fisher information actually drives autopoietic processes, or the efficacy of autopoietic processes. So there's an element of a mathematical model in there. I've also come across a number of models, mathematical models, that I'm not very happy with, because they're basically entropy models, thermodynamic models, and thermodynamic models have issues. And my preference is to use information-based models and probability models, because that's more in line with ideas of consciousness. When we're talking about consciousness also, and we're talking about the ability of complex adaptive systems to live, to survive, we're talking also about self-maintenance, and we're also talking about self-sustainability. And for me, they're ontologically distinct. So self-maintenance is really associated with the ability to establish controls that relate to one's actions and the structures that enable actions to occur. and self-sustaining is more related to homeostatic processes that enable the organization, the organism as a whole, whatever it may be, to survive despite perturbations and despite errors that might occur in its autopoietic processes. Anyway, that's...
Larry?
I'm just reminded of an interview that was done with Francisco Varela. It was in 1999, and it appeared in Inquiring Mind. I mean, I can read just a brief section of it. So the interviewer asks, of course, we can get into an infinite regression about who or what is actually recognizing the pure awareness or developing mindfulness. Varela, I'm beginning to feel that precisely because there is an impossible infinite regress, at some point we might have to turn the picture around in the following sense. In the West, we talk about how matter, body and brain, might be the necessary conditions for the emergence of the mind. That is the scientist's assumption. However, there's another hypothesis, which is that consciousness itself is the basic stuff of the universe, and that we are the emanation of that consciousness as opposed to the origin of the evolutionary source of it. Of course, to accept that, we would have to give up the idea that everything is based on some material property. But I also feel that we may come to a new way of thinking about this whole issue in a non-dual way, even though I still don't have any idea how to articulate it. I think there may be a big shakeup in the scientific community over this dilemma that will come out of the research itself. Interviewer, the idea that the basic stuff of the universe is consciousness itself is found in the Vajrayana Buddhism. Varela, yes, the Vajrayana point of view is as one-sided as that of science. The scientists on one side saying that evolution is the source of consciousness, while the other side is saying that consciousness is the source of evolution. If you want to investigate thoroughly, you cannot hold on tight to either position.
Michael?
I just want to point out that's a false dichotomy that Varela is erecting.
False dichotomy between mind and between those two positions? Is that what you mean, Peter?
Yes, there are other positions. Again, like I showed some of those different ontologies where awareness and matter are inextricably intertwined, so you can be a non-limited materialist and still think that awareness is a fundamental aspect of the universe. That's what I think. But I don't believe. I mean, Varela had lapses into Platonism and Buddhism, and I don't think has a very clear working ontology. But that's another matter.
Well, I guess I would just, since Jason gave me a chance here to speak, thanks for including me. And Francis and Shima, thank you for the presentation. It really helped add to what you had sent out earlier. I do think that there's quite a bit of circling between the metaphysical problems, challenges that we're facing here, at least as I can read into them. And I appreciate Larry bringing in an additional perspective here, of which I will sort of remain metaphysically agnostic. I don't think that Chalmers' question about the hard problem is ill-posed. I think it's ill-posed as a scientific question, in the sense that science, we're trying to understand how nature works. We're trying to understand these phenomena. And the metaphysical question is sort of what is the essence of reality in and of itself. And as I'm not a philosopher, I will stay out of that terrain. But I am quite sympathetic, I think, to Varela's position here, and do struggle with trying to reconcile the eliminative materialist position. But setting that all aside, I wanted to make a comment about two comments, really. One is that defining our terms seems to be quite a challenge in this, and one thing that I've heard come up, especially with the Lebet experiment here, is the reportability of mental states. And Jonathan Schooler has done quite a bit of work in studies of metaconsciousness, distinguishing between what we understand to be consciousness and metaconsciousness. Metaconsciousness being that which we can report on, that which we have memory of. And I don't think that the two are the same thing. And as scientists, especially experimentally, we are completely dependent upon the metaconscious perspective. We need people to report on their states, and that is fallible. People don't often report, don't have awareness of what occurred recently. And in particular, the examples of sleep was discussed, and there's now work of probing people's mental state in so-called dreamless sleep, waking them when they're not in REM. And a good proportion of subjects actually report experience. So to call that non-conscious, is it unconscious, non-conscious? Was it just out of awareness? But if we wake them up, there is some essence, there is some experience that I think is occurring there. So exploring that might be of interest. And then the last point I wanted to make was I really appreciate Francis and Shima, that you're linking meaning to affect. And I think, at least from my perspective, this is where the theory has the most traction for me, because the sort of emotional feel, the sort of qualia of this problem, or your soft solution to this problem, to me feels like a scientific place to investigate rather than a metaphysical place. And feeling emotion is often left out of our discussions of consciousness. And so my recommendation, and perhaps we could talk more about this at some point, would be that actually while I like aspects of workspace theory, I think that it may not be the strongest neuronal basis for a sort of affective dimension here, in that some of the more recent work by Mark Soames, inspired by Friston, and actually also some of Terry Deacon's work, has highlighted the importance of like midbrain and brainstem functions to consciousness and emotional experience. Rather than, I think we kind of place the cortical mantle as the sort of seat of consciousness. And some of that work inverts that assumption. And why I think that's relevant is particularly around the autopoietic aspect of your value or of your vector field, right? There's the sort of orientation of that vector, the magnitude of that vector probably depends on whether or not it's going to sustain the system. And that's what the brainstem is doing, right? It's providing all of those autonomic basal functions for sustaining and maintaining the organism. And so I think that there's a potentially really interesting link between the motivational salience literature there and the and emotion and affect, where it might not be strictly a global workspace, but both in a horizontal space across different modules, but also in a vertical sense, extending from cortical cortex to midbrain into the body, and perhaps into more extended space that I think even Shima was insinuating in that field, which may not be even exclusively limited to the body. So those were those are some of the things I wanted to bring up, and I think this is an excellent discussion point. Thank you.
Hugo, Marcus, Claudia. Hugo.
I wanted to make a comment here. I think exactly what you shared, Michael, is that the slide of my presentation about how we can measure it by that stack model, bringing different dimension of each of these theories and also integrating subjective experience with some of the personal reporting of people. I meant to exactly do the same thing that you mentioned, create this basically model of looking at subjective experience as not so much of subjective, but also something that is driven by physiological responses, by neurological activities. At the same time, I think cultural and social field in which we're embedded. So those are things that are feeding our awareness, whether consciously or unconsciously. So I think I want to make a little another point, is that I think my own mind is very much inspired by also epigenetics. I don't know if you know about, some of you might be, or maybe all of you are aware of this epigenetic landscape. I really see it as some sort of our position, the local field is as some sort of an epigenetic field being affected by different inputs of the external, and then the selection process happening at the inside of the local field. Exactly kind of similar to how genes are doing in epigenetic landscape. So but that really being a local field, kind of epigenetic or maybe consciousness field.
Go ahead.
One more comment about the measurements. We just recently had a very interesting suggestion. I don't know how much research has already been done, but you have this kind of research where you use eye tracking to see where the gaze of a person goes to. So one simple interpretation of the field could be, if you show people a complex picture or a complex scene, their eyes will move over different parts of the scene, and they will typically look at those things that are most meaningful. So the typical example is, if you show a face, the gaze of the eyes will be mostly on the eyes, on the nose, on the mouth, and on the side of the face. So these are the more interesting parts, the more meaningful parts of a face. People will typically not look at the forehead, at the brow, or at the cheeks. They will mostly concentrate on the eyes and the mouth. So now that could be a way to measure the implicit field that somebody has. You show them a complex scene, their gaze will quickly go over lots of things, and it will go over certain things that it considers important, which implies that the things where your gaze does not go are considered not important or not meaningful, which could be interpreted as you're not really conscious of them. And then I come to another experimental paradigm that's well known in consciousness research, that's the change blindness. You show people a picture, you remove the picture and immediately show them seemingly the same picture again, but something has changed. And typically people will miss the changes if the changes are not in the meaningful parts of the picture. For example, you show them the same picture, but let's say some car in the background has a different color, or some wall has changed color, or something that was there has been removed. If the picture flickers and then being replaced by this new picture, people will not notice it, which can be understood as they did not consciously observe, let's say, the color of that car. If you would do the same with the gaze experiment, probably you would see that the gaze does not come to rest on that car, and therefore, if it would disappear, you would not notice it. So these are kind of experimental paradigms where you could actually start to measure what is the extent, what is the content of the field. Here it's purely visual, but you could think of similar paradigms, for example, in language. One idea I thought was, you put people in a particular situation and then you let them describe the situation, and then you can look at the vocabulary, which kind of things did they pick up, which kind of things they did not pick up. And one of the measures there that's interesting is the measure of perplexity of language, which means the degree to which language is unpredictable. Now, if people are not very conscious, which we define as that they have a narrow field, they will pick up the most obvious parts in the scene. They will describe them in an obvious, standard way. While somebody who is more mindful, that means that the broader field is looking at more aspects of the situation, may pick up some non-obvious details and describe them typically with a richer vocabulary, with non-obvious phrases. So we're just starting to think about it, but I think there are different ways to operationalize this notion, not just neurally, but in the way people react to psychological experiments, where you can notice the differences between different fields of different people, for example, looking at the same scene.
Bernd has a question. Bernd?
Yes, a question to the researchers about the research and the field of research, because you want to measure, you clearly distinguish in the field of research first-person perspective, a second-person perspective. And what I wonder is you as observers along the lines of Heinz von Förster, but also along the lines of autopoietic theory as observers, you have yourself a first-person perspective. And how do you relate your first-person perspective as observers, as researchers, to the object of your research, the first-person perspective of research subjects, and the second-person perspective of the other things? I think this is a question which implicitly was indicated in some places, but I think we have to confront it squarely.
Let's hear from Marcus and Igor before you answer the question, Francis. Igor,
Okay,
Marcus.
thank you. Thank you, Jason. Well, this discussion is intriguing for me as a non-biologist and non-neurologist, but someone who deals with organizations which also have their, how would I say, neurophysiological structure. We have isomorphic models which show us that and also prove it. Now, I found very interesting, Peter Cariani, you were talking about observables at the level of neural states, experience and information, and I don't know what else. It would be very useful to get first a graphical model and perhaps a mathematical model that shows these dimensions and how they interrelate.
That's what
so
we need bridge laws.
yes,
That relate two different kinds of observables. The public neural observables and the private introspective experiential observables.
well, I would find wonderful if you could come up with such a model and also say, what are the observables? How can we identify them or even measure them as variables?
Well, for example, I work on the problem of pitch perception. And we look at the neural activity patterns in the auditory nerve, so at that level of neural organization. And we know when we listen to a sound, we can match its pitch pretty much unproblematically. It's not a matter of reporting. I think some of those things are a bit overblown, the complications. But we can tell, we can judge whether a pitch of one tone is the same as the other. And we can match pitches very precisely and robustly and repeatedly. So there's a set of pitch judgments and a set of neural observables, neural spiking patterns. And we have a model that predicts what a person will hear in terms of a pitch, given the neural activity patterns. And it's extremely accurate. It predicts pitch down to 0.5%, and it applies to almost all pitch phenomena that we know of. I mean, with some exceptions, but so that's the sort of theory. That's the sort of mapping that we need in order to understand the neural basis of experiential states, in my opinion. And the thing is that you can't mix different kinds of observables. I mean, you can talk of that in terms of causal relations, but in a model, I think a model where you're looking at neural dynamics, or it's an infraprocess model which is given certain aspects of neural activity, then you're predicting what kind of functions are possible. And then there's a neurophenomenological model that maps the observed neural states to experiences. I mean, does that answer your question?
Well, unfortunately, I didn't get the last minute of what you said for some instability of the net. I mean, I think I gather approximately what you are saying. My only final answer is, or what I can say is that it would be very useful to have a rather general model, that goes beyond the pitch or so on. The pitch is one instantiation, sure,
Yeah,
but which puts these things together.
yes, I agree entirely. On the organizational level, on human organizations, we might have organizational observables about how an organization must be structured, organized, in order to have particular functions that are then useful for its persistence, adaptivity and persistence. So the nature of those observables will be different, and the models will be of a different sort.
Well, I think it would be wonderful to get to the following point. We have in the organization theory, we have I would say the boldest organization theory that exists to my knowledge is a Stafford Beer's viable system model, which is a homomorphic mapping on the neurophysiological structure of the human nervous system. Yeah. And I mean, it's very...
Organizations have sensors, they have effectors that influence the outside world, they have memory, they have goals, they have, you could even say they have affective states in a certain way. So I think that the mapping can be achieved, and I think it's useful. It gives you a functionalist model of how an organization, human organization, needs to be organized in order to persist in a changing environment.
Mm-hmm. So, for example, we have not covered the whole biological dimension. We have covered the neurophysiological dimension, not the biological one, but I think a specific model on consciousness would be something very potentially powerful.
Well, the problem, in my view, the problem is, there are global neural workspace models, which are the best we have, and I agree with Francis and Shima, but what is lacking is we don't have a theory of neural coding at the cortical, beyond the sensory and motor peripheries. We don't understand the nature of the signals of the system. And I think that they could be temporal patterns of spikes, but the dogma is it's which neurons are firing at which instant. Until we solve that problem, we really won't have predictive models that will give us insights into why our experience is structured the way that it is. Where the places where we have the best grasp of the neural codes are in the sensory systems, because we can correlate the neural activity patterns with the stimuli and with the percepts in a very precise way. So it's going to be a while before we have, say, the neural codes for affect or mindfulness or anything like that.
Well, thank you, Peter. That's very insightful.
Igor, you want to say something?
Oh, I could, but I'm not. I'm not a neurologist, right? So my language, my ontology is just, increased a lot today. Thank you for that. Now, maybe a few remarks from my side, which is information technology, data science. And yes, the interesting part you mentioned in the end, you know, is about how are you going to measure the awareness of certain things. And you suggested eye tracking, which is nice because now we have for the first time a chance to really measure eye tracking. And yes, we are doing something very similar, but I would like to point a different problem about that, and that is this what we are doing? You know, trying to investigate awareness, consciousness of individuals. Is this something we can do it? Is it something we should do it? And if we are doing that, are we doing this the correct way? And yes, you know, I didn't hear any ethical issues today, so we are only trying to see if it's working. I'm very much opposing that. Sorry to say that. It is important that we do it correctly and ethically, especially because we are doing maybe this for the first time. After that, some algorithms of AI will take it over. And if the concept of ethical approach to that is not embedded in that, we are going to face the environment which will understand us much better than we understand ourselves. And this is something I would really like to point out. So not focusing entirely on the topic, but if we are discussing that and do not involve ethical considerations, I think we're doing something wrong. And yes, let's try to correct it. All right. Yep.
Jamie. You're muted.
Did you say Jamie? Sorry.
Yeah, I said Jamie.
Yeah. I realized it was 1 o'clock, and so I wasn't sure maybe that it would be more appropriate to keep my comments to a follow-up
We probably
session.
need a follow-up. We probably need.
But since you give me an opportunity, I want to take what Igor said and use it as a jumping board. So the thing is really, as Peter indirectly pointed out, the observable, and so he implies neural correlates that's good enough for the unobservable mind. But the reality is just a correlate. So we still have this thing of how do we conceptualize the unobservable mind. And as I heard you talk about global workspace, I recognize this Bernie Bars, I believe. This he thought of the mind as he was actually using a dramaturgical metaphor. So does the mind as a theatrical workspace, but instead of just saying no, we don't need metaphors, if we really start thinking about metaphors, it helps us think also that each metaphor has limitations. And as researchers, we are using metaphors ourselves, and that we really need to develop a grasp of the limitations, and we need to become comfortable talking about these limitations. And then I think, Francis and Shima, your work is important in that you bring affect and you put it in the front seat. And that is what we desperately need, a model of the mind and consciousness that makes affect central. And I think it will be much easier to argue and easier to understand for others if you would pay more attention to your metaphors and say, I'm using them, and you're using them, and everyone is using them. And these are the ones that I focus on, and I understand their limitations, but that helps us develop a common ground more easily. And then maybe as a last sentence, dus Jason always tells us we should think as problem solvers. And I think when we acknowledge the limitations of our metaphors, we become slightly better at seeing ourselves as problem solvers.
Okay, Francis, Shima, want to do a concluding remark? Answering all these.
I want to thank everyone for joining the discussion. It's very exciting to see that our theory, half baked, but still is, people are eating it, I think consuming it. It's very interesting and inspiring. I really want to appreciate the comment of lady, I didn't pick up your name from, just disappeared from the screen. Margaret, I think she was. I appreciate your comment, and I think I just want to make a very short and quick comment to gentleman Igor. I think you mentioned about the ethicality of the theory, the last slide about connecting it to artificial intelligence. Actually, because of the ethics that we think our theory can help to develop an AI that is in a better relationship with man. So I mentioned we can probably, hopefully, this is, I think, a very ambitious objective, to have decision on degree of artificiality of artificial intelligence and how, to what extent it can come close to have subjective experience equal to humans, therefore gaining that position that you mentioned. So that is my my comment, and I have my notes also ready, which I didn't share today because the 7th slide. I will be happy to share them with everyone, and I am very open to receive your feedback, and thank you very much for listening to us. Thank you.
Yeah, okay. One concluding remark I would like to make, it something that Shima already implicitly said, but it is that part of what our theory wants to do is also to be applied. That means once you have a better idea of what conscious experience is, then you can change it, you can use it, you can make it better. And that was also the idea, like things like mindfulness or meditation are supposed to help you expand your consciousness. But what does that mean, expanding consciousness? For that, you need to have a model of consciousness where there is something that can be expanded, that can be measured. And what the local field theory in part does is a way to kind of quantify potentially the range of consciousness, and through these experiments like with the gaze, you can also then operationalize it, means measuring it, and then you could, for example, that was one experiment we thought of, you could, for example, have people meditate for 10 minutes and do the experiment with the gaze, or not meditate and do the experiment with the gaze, and then one of the hypotheses might be, if they have meditated, their gaze will wander more widely, their field will be broader, they will have a wider range of potential things they may be interested in than if they are not meditated. Or you could make other predictions. If you tell them a story that puts them in a negative mood, they are also likely to have a more narrow consciousness. That's one of the typical theories in psychology, that is that positive emotions broaden your awareness while negative emotions narrow it. So there are all kinds of potential tests and applications if you define something like this width and intensity of an awareness field. So that I think is one of the missing things in consciousness research, the way I have seen it up to now.
That's great. Do you guys want a follow-up session? Who else would like to follow up with this perhaps in May or later April? Claudia?
I think it would be interesting.
It would be interesting. One vote only. Igor vote too. Okay, and Peter, of course. We haven't had a chance to
Sure.
from Audi. Audi, go ahead. Okay.
Yeah.
So
what most attract me, if I can say something,
yes,
since I've been in touch with these arguments in the last period, but also during my studies of the music, because while you play the music and you practice, you have the sense of awareness that is growing through this position. for me is very clear what it was explained, also connecting with my practice, which is affecting very much my state of mind, my state of consciousness, affects the production of my music. So thank you very much for letting me be part of this process, because I feel it's also a process of defining something that words. Maybe that's why I'm a musician. I chose the music because it gives me a lot of clarity. And yeah, words seems to be now at this point really difficult. We are about probably to change the language. I feel we are changing the language. So thank you so much. And
thank you
see
so
you soon.
much.
I'm sure
Probably Peter, Francis, Shima, could you please send me your slides so I can share with our members, and let's schedule a follow-up session. You haven't had a chance to hear my presentation yet, so maybe in a follow-up session, I will be focused on the limitation part and the localness part, and the possible applications and usefulness of this interesting work. Okay, no more words. Thank you very much for coming.